All right. Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to drift into something older than motivation, older than self-improvement. Since you clicked the first roles we were given, here is the quiet question we're carrying tonight. What was identity before language, before mirrors, before careers, before anyone could say, "This is who I am"? In this episode, we're not chasing modern answers. We are excavating the ancient ones. The evidence suggests that for most of our past, identity was not something you discovered inside yourself. It was something the group recognized, assigned, and protected. Because survival depended on predictable roles. Now imagine this. A human life with no biography, no introduction, no moment where you stand apart from the world and say, "This is me." No mirror waits nearby, no written name follows you. Even the idea of an inner private self, the kind you can explain in sentences, is not something we can safely place into the deep past because sentences do not fossilize. Yet a person still moves through a day. They still wake, carry, cut, watch, wait, learn, fail, succeed, and return. And around them, other people notice. They notice not what is hidden inside, but what repeats. The question is simple and quietly uncomfortable. What were you before you could describe yourself? For most of prehistory, identity seems to have been enacted, not declared. We do not know for certain what early Homo sapiens thought about themselves in the way modern humans do, but the evidence suggests that in small groups, the most meaningful version of who you were could be read from what you did and how reliably you did it. Identity, in that sense, was less a confession and more a pattern. Archaeology is not a mind-reading device. It cannot recover private thoughts, childhood dreams, or the language someone used for their own fears. What it can recover, sometimes with surprising clarity, is repeated behavior carried out in physical space among other people over time. When we strip away modern expectations and look only at what survives, the first selves appear less like inner narratives and more like roles that a group could recognize without needing anyone to explain them. This is where the evidence begins to feel intimate in a strange way. A stone tool is not only a tool, it is also a trace of a sequence, and sequences have authors. When archaeologists refit stone flakes back onto a core piece by piece, they are not merely doing a puzzle for fun. They are reconstructing decisions. A certain angle chosen repeatedly, a certain economy of movement, a certain refusal to waste material can suggest a practiced napper rather than a beginner. In some assemblages, the debris fields show clusters that look like learning in progress, with mistakes, resets, and uneven control, near other clusters that show confident reduction with fewer errors. We cannot claim we are watching a teacher and an apprentice with certainty, but the patterned contrast suggests that skill was unevenly distributed and that unevenness would have mattered socially. In a world where cutting, scraping, and shaping were not hobbies, but infrastructure, competence was not merely personal. It was something the group depended on. If a person consistently produced useful edges, they were not just someone who made tools. They were someone the group could plan around. The same quiet logic appears in how sites are organized. In many occupations, activity areas separate as though people were doing different things in different places, repeatedly, not randomly. Hearths become centers of repeated tasks with patterns in burned bone, ash composition, and debris distribution that imply cooking, heating, tool maintenance, and social proximity. Elsewhere, away from the fire, napping debris accumulates in a scatter that suggests focused production. In another area, animal processing leaves its own signature. Cut marks on bone, fracture patterns from marrow extraction, and the location of heavier fragments that were not carried far. None of this tells us what people called themselves. It tells us something older. that groups structured themselves around predictable tasks, and that individuals became recognizable in the flow of those tasks. Even without a word for identity, there was something like identity in the way a camp held together, because camps require coordination, and coordination requires expectations. It is important here to separate two things that modern life often collapses. There is the private experience of being a person, and there is the public fact of being legible to others. Archaeology mostly touches the second. A person might have felt many things that never became visible, but what shaped group survival was what others could count on. Role recognition is, at root, a solution to uncertainty. In a small foraging band, days are stitched together by tasks that cannot be postponed indefinitely. Someone must know where water is. Someone must manage an injury. Someone must interpret a track. Someone must decide whether a sound is harmless or dangerous. These do not need titles to function. They need repetition. A group does not require you to explain your essence. It requires you to be reliably useful, or reliably cautious, or reliably attentive in ways that other people can anticipate. The self, in that kind of world, may not begin as a private possession at all. It may begin as a public prediction. Early Homo sapiens' social lives are almost entirely invisible to us in their details, but they are not invisible in their consequences. We can infer group size ranges from site formation, resource transport decisions, and the scale of shared activity areas. We can infer that people returned to places or did not from repeated occupation layers. We can infer cooperation and care from survival, with injuries that would have been disabling without help. We can infer that knowledge was transferred, not merely stumbled upon, when skills appear consistently within a tradition rather than as isolated accidents. These are thin inferences, and we should treat them with humility. Still, even thin inferences point toward a thick reality. People lived among people, and their lives were shaped by constant mutual observation. In that setting, who you are is not a philosophical statement. It is a practical summary of what you tend to do, how you tend to behave, and how others respond to you in return. This is also where archaeology's limits are not a weakness, but a correction. Modern identity talk often assumes that the truest self is internal, and that public roles are masks layered on top. The deep record resists that assumption, not by disproving inner life, but by showing how little of inner life can be separated from what a group demands. When the only enduring evidence is action, the first selves we can responsibly talk about are enacted selves. That is not a claim that early humans had no inner worlds. It is a reminder that inner worlds do not feed a campfire, do not repair a tool edge, do not keep a child alive, and do not make a group succeed in a dangerous landscape unless they translate into shared behaviour. In the long stretch before explicit autobiographical self-description becomes accessible to us, identity looks like something that happens between people, not inside a solitary mind. If you follow this line gently to its conclusion, something becomes clear. Identity does not require language to exist in a functional form. It requires recognition. It requires that other people treat you as a certain kind of person based on what they have seen you do. That recognition can be kind, pragmatic, or harsh. It can be flexible or rigid. We will not pretend we can measure that flexibility in the earliest periods with precision. But we can say this: before anyone could narrate themselves, the group was already doing a kind of narration on their behalf. It was not poetic. It was not motivational. It was the plain survival logic of small communities. The first selves were not announced, they were recognized by others. This is Sleepless Homo, soft science and slow storytelling for tired minds. We move through archaeology, anthropology, and deep time the way you move through a dark room with a small light. Calmly, carefully, without pretending we know more than we do. If this kind of quiet learning helps you, you can gently like the video and subscribe. It tells the algorithm to play slow, evidence-first stories in front of other sleepless thinkers too. And I want to ask you something simple. How are you listening right now? Before sleep, while working, driving, walking, or with headphones in the dark? If you drift off, the timestamps will be waiting when you come back. Alright, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. You're walking close enough to others that you can hear their breathing, but not so close that you can assume you belong. There is no courtroom for judgment and no word yet for rejection, but the body already understands the difference. Your stomach tightens, your attention sharpens, your eyes keep returning to the same small signs. Who shares food, who shares warmth, who is allowed to sit near the centre, who is spoken to with ease, and who is met with silence. The question is not sentimental, and it is not modern. Why does fitting in feel like safety, even when it costs you? We do not know for certain how early Homo sapiens named these feelings, or whether they named them at all, but the evidence suggests that belonging did not begin as a personality preference. It functioned as a buffer against risk long before complex culture, long before formal rituals, long before anyone could argue that identity should be authentic. In a small group, danger is not an abstract possibility. It is a nightly calculation. Predators do not need many seconds. Injuries do not negotiate. Illness does not care about your independence. In such conditions, the difference between being inside a coalition and being outside it could be measured in calories, body heat, protection, information, and the chance that someone will look for you when you do not return. Belonging, in that sense, is not a warm feeling added to life. It is an invisible infrastructure that makes life possible. The costs of exclusion become clearer when we remember how vulnerable humans are as a species. Compared with many mammals, human infants require extended care, and human adults remain dependent on others in ways that are easy to forget in modern settings. We tend to picture early humans as self-contained and rugged, because the past is often imagined as a place of solitary strength. Yet the biological reality is quieter and more interdependent. A cut that becomes infected, a sprain that limits walking, a fever that drains strength, a tooth that breaks and turns eating into pain. These are not small inconveniences in a landscape without stored abundance. They are threats that can cascade. Coalition support is what turns individual fragility into collective resilience. You survive not only because you are competent, but because you are held in a net of people who will tolerate your temporary weakness, who will share, who will wait, who will adjust plans around you. That kind of net does not exist for someone who is not trusted, not liked, or not considered part of the group. This is where conformity begins to look less like cowardice and more like communication. Behavioral conformity in small groups under pressure can serve as a signal of reliability. The group needs to predict you, not in the philosophical sense, but in a practical one. Will you keep watch when you say you will? Will you share information rather than hoard it? Will you return when you leave? Will you respect the movement decisions that keep everyone alive? In environments where coordination matters, unpredictable individuals create risk for others, even if their intentions are harmless. A person who ignores shared norms is not merely expressing individuality. They're introducing uncertainty into a system that survives by reducing uncertainty. We should be cautious here, because we cannot excavate norms directly from the Middle Stone Age, but we can infer that norms existed because cooperation without expectation is unstable. If people repeatedly cooperated, and if they did so across time, then some system of expectation, correction, and reinforcement must have been present, even if it was never spoken as a rule. Coalition support becomes especially visible when we look at the kinds of tasks that are safer when done together. Foraging in variable landscapes, tracking animals across open ground, moving through unfamiliar terrain, defending against predators, even managing conflict within the group. These are not only physical challenges, they are social challenges because they require coordination. Coordination creates opportunities for free-riding, betrayal, or reckless behaviour, which means groups that cannot detect reliability are groups that fracture. Over long spans of time, selection pressures can favour minds that are tuned to social cues, not because social life is decorative, but because social life is the vehicle through which food, safety, and care are distributed. In other words, belonging is not only a cultural story, it is also a biological strategy. There is also a darker side to this strategy, and it is part of what makes the topic worth facing without comfort language. Belonging is not only a comfort, it is a pressure. When acceptance carries survival value, the fear of losing it becomes a shaping force. That fear does not need ideology to exist. It does not need modern workplaces, social media, or status games in cities. It can exist in a band of a few dozen people, because the stakes are immediate. The same psychological machinery that makes cooperation possible can also produce conformity that feels costly. A person can suppress impulses, hide weakness, follow the group's pace, tolerate unfairness, or accept a role that does not fit perfectly, because the alternative is to be alone. In that light, fitting in is not always a gentle achievement. Sometimes it is a bargain made under pressure. If we step back and look at the human story as a whole, this is one of the strange continuities. Humans are unusually social, but not only because we enjoy company. The social brain, as many researchers have argued, is in part a response to the complexities of living with others, tracking relationships, and maintaining alliances. Social connection becomes a form of risk management. The more dangerous and uncertain the world, the more valuable stable coalitions become. And once coalitions matter, individuals must become legible within them. They must be recognizable as safe, useful, loyal, predictable, or at least non-threatening. This is where identity begins to take weight, not as self-expression, but as a social signal that reduces the risk others feel around you. Even before there were words for character, there were consequences for being perceived as unreliable. This does not mean early humans lived in constant paranoia or constant submission. It means that the emotional systems that guide belonging likely emerged because they solved real problems. The ache of exclusion, the relief of acceptance, the pull to imitate, the caution around standing out, these can be understood as ancient signals. They are not perfect. They sometimes misfire in modern contexts. But in deep time, they may have prevented dangerous isolation and encouraged cohesion. We do not need to romanticize early life to see this. We also do not need to declare it grim. We can simply acknowledge what the evidence and comparative research suggest, that social life was not optional, and therefore belonging was not a luxury. It was protection disguised as routine. Long before pride, belonging was protection dressed as routine. From that pressure, the earliest identities gained their weight. There is another layer here that is easy to miss because it lives beneath intention. Belonging is not only something you choose, it is also something your nervous system registers before you have time to interpret it. In modern experiments, social rejection reliably activates parts of the brain involved in physical pain processing. And the overlap is not just poetic language, it is measurable physiology. We cannot run these experiments on people from 100,000 years ago, but we can still treat the pattern as a clue to how deep the mechanism goes. If the brain treats exclusion as pain, that is not an accident of modern culture. It is the kind of design you see when something mattered enough for long enough that biology took over the job of persuasion. A creature can ignore advice. It has a harder time ignoring pain. So the feeling that comes with slipping outside a group might not have originated as insecurity. It may have originated as a warning system, calibrated in landscapes where being unattended at the wrong moment could end a life. And once belonging is wired into the body at that depth, conformity stops looking like a moral weakness and starts looking like a default setting. We can also see belonging as a form of regulation. Humans do not merely share information or labour. We share temperature, vigilance, and emotional equilibrium. In foraging societies documented in ethnography, sleeping is often communal, not because people love crowds, but because the night is a problem that individuals solve poorly. Groups reduce the chance that any one person will be surprised, and they spread the cost of vigilance through rotation and mutual awareness. Even without formal guard duty, the presence of others changes what the body can risk. The same applies to children, to the sick, to anyone slowed by injury, and even to the healthy, because a healthy person becomes unhealthy quickly when alone. This kind of mutual regulation leaves indirect traces: the repeated use of sheltered locations, the persistence of hearth-centered spaces that imply shared warmth and shared attention, the clustering of activities that make sense only if people trusted proximity. None of this proves affection. It proves coordination under pressure, and coordination has a side effect that becomes psychologically profound. When your safety depends on the steady presence of others, the mind begins to treat social harmony as part of the environment, like water, like shelter, something you monitor constantly, because you cannot store it for later. From there, the strange emotional arithmetic of belonging becomes easier to understand. A person might accept a smaller share of food, a lower status position near the edge of a social circle, or the quiet irritation of being corrected, because those costs are predictable. Uncertainty is the larger threat. In that sense, the group's expectations become a kind of weather system. You do not negotiate with it every day. You learn its patterns and you move within them, and over time the individual self becomes less like a private territory and more like a set of permissions: what you're allowed to do, where you're allowed to go, what you're trusted to handle, and how much doubt your presence creates in others. This is one reason identity consistency can matter more than truth. Not because truth is worthless, but because a group cannot survive on sincerity alone. It survives on coordination, and coordination depends on predictability. A person who changes too quickly, even in positive ways, can become difficult to plan around. A person who behaves in ways others cannot interpret becomes a question mark, and question marks are dangerous when food and safety depend on timing. So when modern humans feel that familiar pull to be acceptable, to be understood quickly, to avoid becoming strange to people they rely on, it may not be a fashionable weakness. It may be an ancient inheritance from nights when the edges of camp were cold, and the distance between bodies was not just emotional. Long before pride, belonging was protection dressed as routine. From that pressure, the earliest identities gained their weight: a body that never wrote a sentence, never carved its name into stone, never stood before a mirror and rehearsed a story about who it was. Then imagine that same body, tens of thousands of years later, lying quietly in sediment, while a light passes over bone and suddenly the past becomes specific. If identity was role, where does the evidence hide? We do not know for certain how early Homo sapiens understood the relationship between self and work, or whether they separated the two at all. But the evidence suggests that repetitive tasks can leave signatures that outlast memory. In bioarchaeology, the body is treated not as a symbol, but as a record. Bone is living tissue that responds to stress, load, and injury. It grows, remodels, and sometimes thickens where forces repeat. It can also wear down where movement becomes routine. None of this gives us a job title, and it certainly does not give us a personality. Yet it can sometimes offer something just as sobering. It can tell us what kinds of strain someone carried so often that their skeleton quietly adjusted around it. One of the first places researchers look is where muscle and tendon attach to bone, the enthyses. These attachment sites can show changes associated with repeated mechanical loading. The idea is simple, and the reality is cautious. If a person habitually uses certain muscle groups intensely over long periods, the attachment areas may develop more robust features or show patterns consistent with stress. But we have to say this carefully, because enthesal changes are not a direct diary of occupation. Age matters, sex differences matter, genetics matters, general activity levels matter, health and nutrition matter. Even the way a person moves through childhood can influence adult bone structure. So the honest approach is never to point at a single roughened ridge and declare, "This person did exactly this." The evidence suggests something more modest and more realistic. When patterns appear across multiple individuals in a population, and when those patterns cluster by age, sex, or burial context, they may reflect repeated behaviours that were not evenly distributed. That unevenness is where role begins to re-enter the picture. Degenerative joint changes can also become a kind of map, though a blurred one. Osteoarthritis, vertebral compression, joint surface wear and remodelling are not only consequences of time, they are also consequences of use, especially when heavy loading and repetitive motion accumulate. In some prehistoric skeletal samples, certain joints show wear patterns that suggest frequent squatting, kneeling, carrying, or long-distance walking. The spine can show changes consistent with habitual load-bearing. The shoulders and elbows can show signs associated with repeated upper limb stress. But again, there is humility built into the method. Degeneration does not equal a single task. It is a chorus, not a solo. What matters is the distribution of that chorus across a group. If everyone shows the same pattern, it may reflect the baseline demands of living. If some show it strongly and others do not, it hints at differentiated routines. Not necessarily rigid specialization, but repeated expectations that fell unevenly across bodies. Then there are injuries, the most blunt kind of evidence, and sometimes the most human. Fractures, dislocations, and healed trauma can reveal how often people were hurt, what kinds of risks they faced, and whether they survived long enough to heal. A healed fracture is not just an anatomical event, it is a temporal one. It implies weeks or months of altered capacity. In a world where daily tasks were not optional, recovery required accommodation. Someone with a severe leg injury would have struggled to keep pace with a moving group. Someone with a broken arm would have been limited in tool use, carrying, or processing food. We cannot always prove caregiving from a single healed break, because people can sometimes survive with partial function, and because some fractures are compatible with continued movement. Still, when injuries are severe and survival extends well beyond the initial trauma, the evidence suggests tolerance, support, and adaptation by others. Not necessarily tenderness in the modern sense, but practical inclusion. The group, in effect, permitted the injured person to remain a person inside the social boundary, rather than becoming a liability left behind. That permission is one of the quietest forms of identity we can glimpse, because it shows that membership could persist even when performance temporarily failed. Dental wear adds another set of clues, often overlooked because teeth feel small compared with bones. Teeth, however, preserve astonishing detail. Enamel wears according to diet, grit, and habitual use. In many foraging populations, heavy dental wear can reflect tough foods, abrasive particles introduced during processing, or diets containing windblown dust and sand. But teeth can also show patterns consistent with non-dietary use. In some archaeological contexts, grooves and wear facets suggest that teeth were sometimes used as tools to hold material, soften fibres, strip hide, or clamp objects while hands worked. When such wear appears repeatedly, it implies daily behaviours that were stable enough to become routine. Again, we do not leap from a tooth groove to a confident claim. We treat it as another thread. When combined with skeletal stress patterns, hand-bone morphology, and tool evidence in the same archaeological horizon, it strengthens a cautious inference that certain repeated tasks were part of someone's lived role, woven into the body at multiple points. There is also the matter of asymmetry, a subtle but telling feature. Human bodies are not perfectly symmetrical in use. Handedness, preferential loading, and repeated unilateral tasks can leave slight differences between left and right limb robusticity. When a population shows consistent asymmetry patterns, it can reflect habitual behaviours shared by many. When asymmetry varies, it may reflect diverse routines. This is not about proving modern occupational categories. It is about recognising that daily life was not evenly distributed, and that some individuals, over long spans, carried particular forms of strain. A person who habitually throws, carries, pounds, or scrapes may develop slight differences that compound across years. The skeleton does not announce why those differences exist, but it preserves that they existed and that someone's daily life had a shape. At this point, the responsible question becomes not what exact job someone had, but what kind of social system produces bodies that differ in patterned ways. Because bodies do not remodel themselves into categories for fun. They remodel because certain demands repeat. If a group repeatedly relies on particular individuals for certain tasks, even informally those individuals will accumulate distinctive stress signatures over time. This is where identity, understood as role and expectation, becomes physically plausible. A role does not need to be named to be real. It needs to be repeated, noticed, and relied upon. The skeleton is a slow witness to that reliance. And yet, we should also acknowledge the limits, because the limits are part of the story. Osteological interpretation is probabilistic, not declarative. Many stress markers are non-specific. Many injuries can result from multiple causes. Preservation biases distort what survives. Sample sizes can be small. Burial practices can skew representation. Even the very act of finding remains is uneven across regions and time periods. So when we talk about identity through bone, we are not claiming a clean window into the past. We are describing a method of careful constraint. The evidence suggests that bodies can carry traces of repetitive life, and that those traces, when interpreted in population patterns, can hint at the distribution of tasks, the tolerance of injury, and the endurance of membership. It is not a story of certainty. It is a story of how much the material world still holds, even when words are gone. If you sit with that for a moment, it becomes quietly unsettling in the way archaeology often is. The body can become a quiet archive of what someone was expected to do, not because anyone intended it as a record, but because repetition is a kind of inscription. And once roles shape bodies over years, those roles begin to shape perception, habit, and attention. The person becomes not only someone who performs a task, but someone who is assumed to be that kind of person. They are approached differently, relied upon differently, corrected differently. trusted differently. The body's adaptations and injuries are not only evidence of labour, they are evidence of a life lived under expectation, and once roles shaped bodies, they began shaping minds. Imagine this. You arrive in the deep past carrying a neat pair of labels, hunter and gatherer, and you hold them out like tools you trust. You want them to fit cleanly, because clean categories feel like understanding. But what if I told you that some of the most confident stories we tell about foragers are shaped less by the record itself and more by our hunger for certainty? How much of hunter or gatherer is real, and how much is a modern story we keep retelling because it makes the chaos of survival feel organised? We do not know for certain how any one prehistoric community divided daily labour, because archaeology rarely preserves the full choreography of a day. What it preserves are fragments, animals processed here, plant remains there, tools left behind, residues on stone, microscopic traces in teeth, isotopic signatures in bone, the spatial logic of camps, and the occasional burial that forces us to look twice. And when those fragments are placed beside one another across many regions and many time periods, a quiet pattern has become harder to ignore. The evidence suggests that subsistence roles in many foraging contexts were often flexible, situational, and responsive to ecology, rather than rigidly fixed by permanent social categories. This is not a claim that roles never existed, or that differences were meaningless. It is a claim about variability. The past looks less like a simple blueprint, and more like a set of adaptive strategies that changed with season, risk, age, injury, pregnancy, illness, local prey, local plants, and the shifting needs of the group. In other words, when people had to keep living, they did not always have the luxury of staying inside a single label. Mixed foraging strategies make ecological sense in a way that ideology never needs to. In most environments, relying on a single food source is a gamble. Large game can be calorie-rich but unpredictable. Plant foods can be dependable but seasonal, dispersed, or labour-intensive. Small animals, fish, shellfish, insects, birds, and tubers each have different risk profiles. The evidence from many prehistoric sites suggests that people built resilience by spreading effort across multiple resources. That resilience tends to pull against rigid specialization. If a drought reduces plant availability, hunting intensity may rise. If herds shift away, fishing or trapping becomes more important. If a season brings abundance in one category, the group can lean into it. This does not require a philosophical commitment to flexibility. It requires only the ordinary intelligence of not wanting to starve. When we find broad-spectrum diets, varied toolkits, and changing faunal profiles within the same region over time, the simplest interpretation is that foragers did what foragers must do. They adjusted. An adjustment often means that competence matters more than category. The person who can track today becomes valuable today. The person who can find water, process plants safely, predict seasonal movement, or repair tools becomes valuable whenever that skill is needed. The group survives by deploying what it has, not by preserving a tidy chart of who is allowed to do what. This is one reason archaeologists have become more careful about projecting modern assumptions onto deep time, especially when those assumptions arrive disguised as common sense. A stone point does not announce who carried it. A butchered bone does not reveal who held the cutting edge. Even when artifacts are associated with a particular area of a campsite, we still face interpretive distance. Ethnographic analogies can help, but they can also mislead, because the range of documented foraging societies is wide and shaped by local conditions, not a single universal template. We do not know for certain whether a pattern observed in one modern group can be applied backward to a site tens of thousands of years older in a different ecology. The responsible move is to treat categories as hypotheses rather than conclusions. When the record is thin, the mind fills it with familiar stories, and hunter and gatherer are familiar stories. They feel like they should be stable, because they are stable in our language. But the past did not owe stability to our vocabulary. Sometimes the record offers moments that sharpen this problem. In some burials, individuals have been found interred with hunting gear, projectiles, or tool assemblages that look like the equipment of a person skilled in hunting large game. In earlier decades, interpretations of such finds often travelled quickly toward rigid conclusions about gendered roles, not because the evidence demanded it, but because the interpreter expected it. More recent work has pushed back with a calmer question. What if grave goods reflect life activities without mapping neatly onto a single modern assumption about who must have performed them? This does not mean every burial is a transparent biography, because burials can be symbolic, selective, and shaped by social messaging. But the broader shift in scholarship has been toward recognizing that the distribution of labor was likely more plastic than the simplest stories imply. Some individuals may have hunted frequently, some occasionally, some never. The same for gathering, fishing, trapping, tool-making, navigation, childcare, and fire management. And those patterns could shift across a lifetime. A young adult might range widely and hunt, then later focus on knowledge transmission, tool repair, or food processing as speed declines. Injury might redirect a person into roles that rely less on long-distance pursuit and more on skill and attention. Pregnancy and nursing might alter mobility and risk tolerance for a period, then loosen again. The evidence suggests not a world without structure, but a world where structure bent under necessity. Cooperative provisioning complicates the picture further, because it makes subsistence less like a personal identity and more like a collective system. If food sharing is a norm, then the line between who acquires and who consumes becomes less morally charged and more logistical. Hunters do not only feed themselves, gatherers do not only feed themselves, people feed a group, and the group's survival depends on the flow. In many foraging societies, large game is shared widely, partly because it spoils, partly because it is unpredictable, and partly because reciprocal sharing reduces future risk. Plant foods can also be shared, and in many environments they form the reliable baseline that keeps days from collapsing when hunts fail. But when the goal is to stabilize calories across uncertain conditions, group logic tends to reward versatility. If a person can contribute in multiple ways, they become a safer investment. If several people share overlapping skill sets, the group becomes less fragile when one person is sick, injured, or absent. That overlap is the opposite of a rigid system, where each role is permanently assigned and non-negotiable. It is redundancy, and redundancy is one of the quiet signatures of systems built to survive. This is where identity becomes less like an essence and more like situational competence. We do not know for certain what early humans felt internally when they performed tasks, but the evidence suggests that social recognition often follows usefulness. If you can do something the group needs, you become someone the group can rely on, and reliance creates expectation. Expectation then feels like identity, not because you announced it, but because others begin to treat you as the person associated with that competence. Yet that association does not have to be forever. In many ecologies it cannot be forever, because the world changes, bodies change, and the group's needs change. So the most realistic model of many foraging contexts is not a set of fixed labels, but a shifting field of tasks where people move toward what is needed and what they can do. The past, in this view, is not a stage where everyone plays one role until death. It is a place where roles are constantly rehearsed, exchanged, and renegotiated in small, practical ways that do not leave dramatic traces. And still, we should not romanticize flexibility as if it was unlimited freedom. Flexibility can exist inside boundaries, just as a river can change course inside a valley. Even in systems with overlapping competencies, groups still require norms about risk, responsibility, and trust. A person cannot simply decide to take on any task without consequence. Dangerous activities require skill. The group has an interest in preventing reckless experimentation when the cost of error is high. So while identity may have been what you could do today, rather than what you were forever, that today still unfolded inside a social framework. Expectations could be strict even when roles were not permanent. Training, mentorship, and permission likely mattered. The ability to contribute might open doors, and incompetence might close them. In that sense, the difference between a modern story and an ancient reality is not that the past lacked categories, but that its categories were often more fluid and more conditional than our words suggest. They were written in seasonality, in risk, in bodies that changed, and in the unglamorous logic of keeping everyone alive. In many worlds, identity was what you could do today, not what you were forever. Yet even flexible roles needed boundaries. You walk toward a small camp before there are banners, before there are emblems, before anyone could point to a mark and say, "This is us." There is only a clearing, a few fires, the weight of bodies settling into the same patch of ground they used last time, and the quiet problem of being accepted. What turns a group into an us before symbols and flags exist? The answer may not begin in speech or myth. It may begin in the simplest geometry of survival, where the heat sits, where the sharp stone is allowed to fly, where food is handled, where you sleep without being watched. It is easy to imagine early camps as casual scatters of people and things, because the remains often look scattered to the untrained eye. But when archaeologists map those scatters carefully, when they follow the distribution of flakes and bones and ash with slow patience, a different possibility comes into view. The evidence suggests that even very early camps were not only places to rest, but places where invisible lines were drawn and learned, lines that turn proximity into belonging. We do not know for certain how rules were spoken, or whether they were spoken at all, but the material record can sometimes show the consequences of rules without recording the words. In many sites, hearths do not sit randomly. They sit where wind, fuel, and shelter make sense, and then the camp seems to organize itself around them. Artifact densities cluster in ways that repeat, with certain tasks tending to happen near the heat and light, and other tasks pushed outward. Stone napping, for example, can leave a signature that is almost like a fingerprint in sediment, small flakes in high concentration, refitting sequences that reconnect broken steps of production, and a halo of micro-debitage that marks a working spot even when larger pieces have been carried away. Food processing leaves different traces, bones with cut marks, fragmented shafts split for marrow, patches of charcoal and ash, residues that hint at plant handling, and sometimes the chemical imprint of repeated burning and disposal. Sleeping areas rarely announce themselves directly, because bedding and skin and hair do not preserve well, but they can be inferred by absence as much as by presence. Fewer sharp flakes where bare bodies might rest, fewer heavy processing remains, and sometimes the placement of hearths at a distance that balances warmth with safety. Ethnographic comparison, used carefully and without pretending that any modern group is a fossil, suggests something else that fits the pattern. Camps in many foraging contexts are structured by etiquette, as much as by convenience. Certain spaces are treated as shared, certain spaces as restricted, certain actions as inappropriate near the wrong people or at the wrong time. Archaeology cannot prove etiquette, but archaeology can show repeated spatial regularities that would be difficult to explain if everyone used every place in every way. When spatial patterning is measured rather than guessed, it becomes a kind of quiet argument. Some of the strongest methods are simple, and they feel almost humble. Plot every artifact, record its depth, note its type, map its distance to the hearth. Then look for clusters, gaps, and pathways of movement implied by repeated deposition. More refined approaches add microscopic and chemical detail. Soil chemistry can sometimes reveal repeated dumping zones where organic waste accumulated, even when the waste itself is gone. Micromorphology can show thin laminations of ash and trampled surfaces, suggesting whether a hearth was used once or returned to again and again. Lithic refitting can reveal not only where tools were made, but where the maker sat, which direction they faced, and whether they cleared away debris. Spatial analysis of faunal remains can indicate whether butchery occurred close to the fire or at a distance, whether certain bones were brought into the centre while others were discarded beyond it. None of this tells us what anyone called themselves, but it can tell us something about what a camp demanded. A camp is not only a shelter against weather, it is also a system for preventing injury, preventing theft, preventing conflict, and keeping essential tasks from interfering with one another. You do not want stone flakes underfoot where children stumble. You do not want raw meat and waste where people sleep. You do not want smoke pushed into a cluster of bodies if you can help it. Practical constraints produce patterns, and patterns become routines. Routines, over time, become norms, and norms are the early scaffolding of identity, because norms decide who can be where without being corrected. In that sense, space becomes a kind of social structure made visible, not in the dramatic way of a palace or a temple, but in the quiet way of repetition. A hearth may function like a centre of gravity, but not everyone stands at the same distance from it. Some people work at its edge, some people tend it, some people orbit it briefly, and some people avoid it. The reasons can be practical, but they also become social. If a tool production zone is consistently located in one part of a camp, the people who sit there become associated with that place. If a food processing space is consistently kept separate, those who work there learn that their work is valued enough to be protected from interruption. If certain areas are treated as clean and others as dirty, then the movement between them becomes regulated, and regulation is one of the oldest forms of belonging. Even the act of stepping around a place can be a lesson. You learn not to cross through someone's working area. You learn not to touch a tool without permission. You learn where waste goes. You learn where water is stored. These are not grand ideas. They are daily physics, but daily physics is what prehistory leaves behind most reliably. And when the same spatial logic appears across multiple occupations, even if separated by many years, it suggests that a camp was not assembled from scratch each time. It was remembered. It was rehearsed. Children are part of this story, not as a sentimental addition, but because learning is one of the most powerful forces shaping human life. A child does not learn a camp's rules by reading a list. They learn by being placed, corrected, redirected, and occasionally stopped with a hand before they step somewhere dangerous. Archaeology rarely preserves children directly, but it sometimes preserves the byproducts of teaching. Small footprints in ancient surfaces have been documented at some sites, pressed into soft ground near hearth margins, indicating that children moved through working areas even when adults tried to maintain order. miniature tools, toy-like objects, and the presence of novice napping mistakes in lithic assemblages can suggest learning near the centre of activity rather than somewhere isolated. We do not know for certain whether these were deliberate teaching contexts or simply children imitating what they saw. But either way, it points toward a simple truth. The layout of camp is a curriculum. It teaches people where they belong before they can explain it. If a child grows up repeatedly seeing that certain actions happen in certain zones, the association between task and place becomes as natural as the shape of the horizon. In time, the child does not merely follow the layout, they defend it. They feel unease when it is violated, even if they cannot say why. This is how an us forms without needing a symbol. It forms through shared expectations that have become physical. Ethnography, when used as a lens rather than a template, helps make this plausible without making it simplistic. In many documented foraging societies, camps are not only efficient arrangements of labour, they are also moral arrangements. People may avoid certain spaces at certain times. They may keep particular tools away from particular contexts. They may treat hearth areas as communal or as belonging to specific households within a larger group. None of these details can be projected backward with certainty. But archaeology does not require exact duplication to learn something. It requires that human needs and constraints leave comparable kinds of traces. A hearth is a hearth, regardless of language. Sharp stone behaves like sharp stone, regardless of myth. Waste rots, smoke drifts, children wander, adults enforce boundaries, and conflict emerges when boundaries are unclear. The evidence suggests that camps often solve these problems in ways that became stable enough to be seen in the distribution of remains. Stable does not mean unchanging across the whole span of prehistory. It means stable enough within a particular community or region for a time to produce repeated patterning. This is the kind of stability archaeology can detect. Not a stable world, but a stable practice in response to a world that never stops applying pressure. And this brings us to the harder part. If camp layout functions as a silent curriculum of belonging, then identity may begin not as a private feeling, but as spatial permission. You are someone because you are allowed to approach certain things, handle certain objects, occupy certain distances, and speak or remain quiet in certain moments. The boundary is not always harsh. It can be gentle, almost invisible, like a hand guiding you away from the sharpest stones, like a glance that says "not here." But invisibility does not make it weak. It makes it pervasive. Once a group has shared rules about space, those rules become the first walls around behaviour, and inside those walls, roles feel natural. You do not have to declare them. You simply find yourself repeating them, because the camp itself has been arranged to pull you into certain patterns and away from others. The past did not need flags to form an us. It needed predictability. It needed trust. It needed a way to keep bodies from colliding when survival work had to happen close together. In that sense, the earliest identities may have been as ordinary as the distance between a sleeping place and a fire, and as powerful as the permission to cross it. Identity may begin as where you are allowed to stand, and from space came expectation. A child sits close enough to the work to feel the heat, but far enough that the sharp stone will not cut them. They are not being trained in a classroom sense because there is no classroom. They are simply present, and presence is the beginning of apprenticeship. When does a human stop being only a child and become a role? In the deep past, that moment was rarely a ceremony we can see. It was more likely a long, quiet gradient, drawn out across years of dependency and observation, in which a small person gradually became useful and then gradually became expected. We do not know for certain how early Homo sapiens spoke about childhood, or whether they spoke about it as a category at all, but the biological reality is difficult to escape. Our species arrives in the world unusually unfinished. Human infants are born dependent to a degree that would be risky without social support, and they remain dependent for longer than most mammals. Compared to other primates, our childhood is stretched, our brains continue developing for years, and our learning period is not a brief preparation but a long life stage. This length is not just a feature of growth, it is a window in which culture can enter the body, and in which the group can do what evolution alone cannot do quickly: shape a mind for a particular world. The evidence for this begins with life history itself. Human development is costly. A child consumes energy before they reliably produce it, sometimes for many years, and that only makes evolutionary sense if the eventual payoff is large. Many scholars argue that the payoff is exactly what this segment is circling. Not merely intelligence as a vague trait, but the capacity to learn complex skills, navigate social nuance, and absorb local knowledge that changes across landscapes and generations. Extended childhood gives the group time to install competence. It also gives the group time to install expectations. When a juvenile brain is plastic, imitation is powerful. Children copy not only what works, but what is approved. They learn what draws laughter, what draws irritation, what draws attention, and what draws that quiet, dangerous silence that says you have stepped outside something important. This is not ideology, it is survival dynamics. A small foraging band living with thin margins cannot afford endless unpredictability inside its own walls. The long human childhood, therefore, becomes a long social project. It is a period in which a child's impulses are slowly rooted into patterns the group can rely on. And this is one of the earliest forms of identity, a set of patterned behaviours that others recognise as you, long before you can explain yourself. Archaeology can rarely show us teaching directly, because teaching is a behaviour that leaves few durable traces, but can show the footprints of learning, the material consequences of hands that are not yet steady. Lithic assemblages sometimes contain what look like novice errors, platforms struck at awkward angles, cores abandoned early, sequences that suggest experimentation rather than mastery. In some well-studied contexts, archaeologists have used refitting to reconstruct the order of napping actions, and to distinguish skilled reduction from hesitant, inconsistent strikes. At a few sites where spatial patterning and refitting are exceptionally rich, like the Magdalenian site of Étiole in France, researchers have argued for the presence of apprentices working near experts, producing imperfect pieces within a broader system of highly competent tool-making. We do not know for certain whether these novices were children or simply inexperienced adults, but the deeper point remains. Learning is visible when it fails in characteristic ways, and failure, repeated in patterned contexts, suggests that skill was not only individually discovered, it was socially supported. The same is true beyond stone. Bone and antler working, cordage, hide processing, fire maintenance, and the reading of tracks all involve procedural knowledge that is hard to invent alone from scratch. A child raised near these tasks does not merely acquire techniques, they acquire timing, permission, and a sense of what kind of person performs which actions without needing to defend it. Ethnographic comparison, used carefully and without flattening the diversity of human societies, can help explain how this shaping happens without formal instruction. In many foraging communities, children learn through what anthropologists often call guided participation. Adults do not always sit a child down and explain steps. Instead, they allow the child to hover, to assist in small ways, to carry, to watch, to imitate, and to receive correction in the moment. A child peels bark badly, and someone shows them a different grip. A child carries water and spills it, and someone gives them a smaller container. A child mimics a throw, and someone adjusts the stance. The learning is embedded in daily life, which means identity formation is also embedded. A child begins to be associated with certain acts because those are the acts they're repeatedly allowed to practice. And allowed is the key word. Permission is a curriculum. It signals trust. It signals risk tolerance. It signals that the group sees a future version of the child that is worth investing in. Over time, the child not only learns skills, but begins to feel that some skills belong to them more naturally than others, because the group has quietly constructed that feeling through repeated access and feedback. This is how a role can emerge before a word for role exists. It is not chosen. It is grown into, inside, a social greenhouse. Play sits at the centre of this process, and it is easy to underestimate because play looks like inefficiency. But in a species where learning is extended, play can be rehearsal disguised as leisure. Young humans practice throwing, chasing, hiding, negotiating, sharing, and refusing. They practice the physics of tools with sticks and stones that do not matter much if broken. They practice social rules with mock conflict and repair. Some of this is likely universal because it is rooted in development. Some of it is shaped by the particular ecology and tool traditions of the group. Archaeology rarely labels something as play with certainty, but it sometimes offers hints. Small, crudely made objects that echo adult tool forms can suggest imitation. Lightweight projectiles, miniature points, or simplified implements might be interpreted as children's practice pieces in some contexts, though caution is always required because small artifacts can also be functional for small tasks. More convincingly, the distribution of novice mistakes near domestic areas suggests that learning and daily life were not separated. Children learned inside the stream of survival, not outside it. And when learning happens in the stream, identity begins to cohere early. A child becomes the one who's good at noticing, or the one who can sit still, or the one who remembers paths, or the one who makes the fire behave, long before any abstract self-concept can be spoken. The group does not need a philosophy of identity to do this. It only needs repeated observation and the practical habit of assigning trust where competence appears. Social feedback is the engine that turns learning into identity. It operates through praise and correction, but also through subtler forces that are older than language. Attention is one of them. If adults watch you when you do something, you learn it matters. If adults ignore an action, it falls away. Another is proximity. If you are allowed near certain tools or tasks, you internalize that you belong there. If you're kept away, you internalize that you do not. A third is imitation itself. Children imitate those they're attached to, and attachment is not only emotional, it is informational. In a world where survival knowledge is local and cannot be carried in books, attachment is a strategy for acquiring a map of reality that has been tested by others. Some evolutionary anthropologists have argued that this is part of why cooperative child-rearing matters so much in human life history. The more social the childhood environment, the more opportunities for learning, and the more stable the channel through which norms can pass. We do not know for certain how cooperative childcare functioned in every prehistoric setting, but the long dependency of children strongly suggests that mothers alone, without support, would have faced severe constraints. If children were raised within a network of adults and older juveniles, then identity formation would also be networked. A child could become someone not only through parental expectation, but through the distributed expectations of many eyes. Seen this way, Childhood in prehistory is not a pause before life begins. It is the period when life becomes legible to others, and when others become legible to you. A child is born with private experience, but private experience is not yet a social identity. Social identity emerges when the group begins to predict you, rely on you, and correct you. In small bands, reliability is not an abstract virtue. It is a resource. If the group cannot predict who will guard, who will carry, who will share, who will keep a fire alive, then the group becomes fragile. The long human childhood offers time to reduce that fragility by gradually shaping individuals into recognizable patterns of contribution. That shaping does not require cruelty, though it can certainly include pressure. It can also include warmth, pride, and the simple relief of seeing someone become capable. But beneath whatever emotions accompanied it, the outcome is the same. The child becomes someone through use, through repeated practice that makes certain behaviors feel natural, and through repeated recognition that makes those behaviors feel like who you are. Childhood was not only growing, it was being shaped into usefulness, and usefulness demanded consistency. You're sitting near a small fire that is not really a fireplace, because nothing in this world is permanent enough to earn a fixed name. People speak softly, or not at all. Someone is repairing something, someone is watching the dark beyond the circle of light. And then, without any dramatic moment, a person does something slightly out of character. Not violent, not loud, not even clearly wrong. Just unusual. Maybe they take more than their share. Maybe they walk off alone at the wrong time. Maybe they refuse to join a routine task they always joined before. The change is small, but the room changes anyway. The air changes. Because in a small group where survival runs on thin margins, inconsistency is not just a personality trait. It is a risk signal. Why does inconsistency feel suspicious to other people? It is tempting to treat that suspicion as modern, like a social habit we learned from schools, workplaces, and bureaucracy. But the evidence suggests something older. The demand for predictable behavior likely predates formal institutions, because unpredictability increased group risk long before any leader could write rules down. We do not know for certain what early Homo sapiens said about trust, or whether they had a single word for it. Yet the structure of the problem is visible without vocabulary. When you live in a small band, your life is interdependent in ways that are hard to recreate in modern imagination. Food is not a private possession produced by isolated effort. It arrives through cooperation or through tolerated inequality that is tracked, remembered, and balanced across time. Safety is not a service you purchase. It is a shared vigilance that depends on whether the person beside you is likely to do what they did yesterday. Even movement itself, when to go and when to wait, becomes safer when others are predictable. Under these conditions, trust becomes a kind of survival technology. Not sentimental, not philosophical, but functional. It reduces uncertainty inside the group so the group can spend its attention on uncertainty outside it. If the landscape is dangerous, then internal predictability becomes one of the few stabilizers available. And that is why a consistent person, even a quiet one, may have been valuable in ways that have nothing to do with morality and everything to do with logistics. Archaeology cannot excavate suspicion directly, but it can excavate the kind of social life that would have made suspicion adaptive. Many sites imply repeated returns by the same group to familiar places, not permanent settlement, but recurring use that suggests memory, coordination, and a shared sense of ours, even without built walls. Some sites show evidence of long-distance material transport, like obsidian moving across landscapes, or marine shells carried far inland. That does not happen without relationships. It also does not happen without reliability. because long-distance exchange and movement require people to keep commitments across time. Likewise, the care of injured or impaired individuals, inferred from healed fractures, long-term survival with degenerative conditions or sustained tooth loss, implies that some groups tolerated dependency for extended periods. Tolerance is not free. It is negotiated, consciously or not, through reputations about who contributes, who reciprocates, who is safe to invest in. We do not know for certain how widely such care occurred or how it varied, but when it did occur, it suggests something important about social accounting. A group that keeps someone alive who cannot fully pay back in obvious ways is still making a decision about future value, about loyalty, about the stability of bonds. Those decisions become easier when individuals are legible, when their behaviour follows patterns that others can predict. Reputation, then, is not a modern invention. It is what memory does when it is social. In small groups, everyone is observed, not with surveillance, but with ordinary attention, the same attention you give to weather when you depend on it. People notice who shares meat without being asked. People notice who disappears when work begins. People notice who panics and who steadies. Over time, those observations become a practical model of each person. That model is what we might call reputation, even if no one ever announces it. Anthropologists studying recent and historic foraging societies often describe dense social knowledge in small bands, where individuals track one another's tendencies, alliances, past conflicts, and reliability. We cannot simply project those descriptions backwards as if human societies were identical across all time, but the logic of small group living makes some form of behaviour tracking plausible. It does not require formal institutions. It requires only recurring interaction and the fact that the same handful of people will be your world for long stretches. In such a setting, inconsistency becomes suspicious, not because difference is hated, but because the future is hard enough without introducing extra randomness from within. The cost of unreliable allies is easiest to grasp when we think of danger that requires coordination. Large game hunting, when it occurred, demanded timing, restraint, and shared risk. Predators demanded collective defense, and not everyone could run at the same speed or fight at the same strength. Even simple foraging can become dangerous under pressure when scarcity pushes people toward riskier prey, longer trips, or contested zones. In these moments, a single unreliable actor can increase the danger for everyone. A person who breaks formation, who fails to signal, who hoards at the wrong time might not just harm themselves, they might pull the whole group into conflict or starvation. Under these conditions, consistency becomes more than a preference. It becomes a signal of future cooperation. If you act like you acted yesterday, others can plan around you. If your choices are stable, your allies can invest in you, share with you, protect you, and expect that the investment will not be wasted. This is not a demand for perfection. It is a demand for predictability, for behavioural continuity that makes social life navigable. This is where the quiet mechanism of enforcement begins, not with laws, but with warmth and withdrawal. In many small-scale societies, social control often operates through subtle sanctions: teasing, gossip, reduced sharing, exclusion from decision-making, and in extreme cases, expulsion. We do not know for certain how these dynamics worked in the Middle Stone Age or the Upper Paleolithic, but the basic tools of social enforcement require no technology beyond attention and memory. Acceptance becomes a resource, and withdrawal becomes a warning. A person learns the boundaries of acceptable variability by feeling when the group leans toward them and when it leans away. In other words, identity is pressured into shape by social consequences, long before anyone writes a story about finding yourself. In this frame, the self is not merely an inner experience. It is also the version of you that others can recognize and trust. The group does not need to hate deviation to penalize it. It only needs to prioritize its own stability. And when stability is survival, the pressure to stay the same becomes a background force, like gravity, always present, rarely named. We sometimes say, in modern self-help language, that the strongest force in human personality is the desire to stay consistent with how we view ourselves. That may be true in part, but it may not be the oldest part. The deeper force might be the need to remain legible to others. A person can privately reinvent themselves all they want, but in a small group, private reinvention is not the main currency. Legibility is. Being understandable, being predictable, being the kind of person whose future behavior can be inferred from the past. This is why inconsistency can feel suspicious even when it is harmless. It triggers the ancient question, not, who are you really, but can I rely on you? And the question is not asked in words, it is asked in glances, in pauses, in who receives food first, in who is invited to travel close, in who is left at the edge of decisions. If identity began as role, then role required trust, trust required reputation, and reputation required consistency, not as a virtue, but as a signal that social life would not become a gamble every morning. There is a quiet sadness inside this, and also a quiet comfort. The sadness is that a human may feel many things privately, but the group will often reward what is legible, not what is true. The comfort is that legibility is also how care becomes possible. You can only invest in someone emotionally or materially if you have some confidence in who they will be tomorrow. Even tenderness is easier when you can predict the shape of another person. So the pressure to stay the same is not only repression, it is also scaffolding. It is the structure that lets cooperation persist across time, especially when the outside world offers little stability. And once legibility mattered, deviation became costly. You do something small that shifts the outline of you. Not a dramatic rebellion, not a declaration, just a slight drift from what the others have come to expect. In a world without written rules, without courts, without even a stable calendar, the drift is noticed anyway. Someone pauses mid-task. Someone laughs in a way that is not quite friendly. Someone does not hand you the object you usually receive, or does not make room beside the warmth. What happens to someone who will not stay in their expected shape? We like to imagine that early human groups were gentle simply because they were small, as if smallness automatically produces softness. But the evidence suggests a more complicated truth. In many small-scale societies, cohesion is not a luxury. It is insulation against hunger, injury, predators, rival groups, and the simple mathematics of being fragile animals on a difficult landscape. When cohesion protects the group develops ways to protect cohesion. Sometimes those ways are quiet, sometimes they are sharp, often they are both at once. We do not have an archaeological layer labelled ridicule, the way we have a layer of ash or a scatter of stone flakes. Yet we can approach the problem through a different kind of record: ethnographic comparison, evolutionary logic, and the repeated structural pressures that appear wherever people live in small groups with high interdependence. Many foraging societies described in ethnography rely heavily on what could be called low-cost enforcement. Instead of formal punishment, there is teasing, mockery, deliberate ignoring, refusal to share, avoidance that spreads like cold air through a camp. These are efficient tools because they do not require violence, and they do not require a centralized authority. They also scale naturally to small groups, where everyone is visible and the social memory is dense. The mechanisms vary, sometimes dramatically across cultures and landscapes, but the underlying function often looks familiar. A group uses social discomfort to steer members back toward predictable participation. It is not always about stopping badness. It is often about stopping unpredictability. Unpredictability is expensive when everyone's safety depends on the next person doing what they usually do. One of the more striking patterns in ethnographic accounts of egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups is the way status is managed through social leveling. Among the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, for example, the practice often called insulting the meat has been described as a way to prevent boasting and dominance from destabilizing the band. A hunter returns with a kill, and instead of praise, people downplay it, joke about it, treat it as ordinary. On the surface, it can look cruel. Underneath, it functions as a stabilizer. A band that allows one person's success to harden into authority may become vulnerable to coercion, resentment, and fracture. The mockery is not only punishment, it is calibration. In other places, teasing targets laziness, unreliability, or social aggression. The details differ, but the common theme is that the group does not wait for a legal crisis. It corrects drift early, through cheap signals that can be repeated without bloodshed. In this sense, ridicule is not a petty emotion. It is a tool that costs almost nothing and can prevent conflicts that cost everything. Avoidance and exclusion may be even older than ridicule, because they require no performance at all. To exclude someone in a small camp, you do not need to build a prison. You can simply not look at them. You can stop inviting them into the small moments where decisions are made. You can walk a little farther away when you sit down. You can share information with others, but not with them. If resources are pooled, you can delay their share or offer less, or offer it in a way that signals it is reluctant. We do not know for certain how often these pressures were used in deep prehistory, but it is plausible that such strategies were available wherever groups were small enough that people could coordinate their attention. In many fission fusion societies, another form of sanction is simply rearranging the social world. If conflict rises, a group can split. People can leave with kin or with allies, and the person who created the disturbance is left with fewer connections. In harsh environments, that can become a slow form of punishment that looks, from the outside, like simple mobility. But socially, it is a rearrangement of protection. Conflict mediation sits beside these pressures, and it's worth noticing because it shows that enforcement is not always hostility. Many small-scale societies have informal methods for managing disputes without tearing the group apart. Public discussion, intervention by respected older individuals, ritualized contests, or structured forms of verbal confrontation. Inuit song duels are often cited as a way of channeling conflict into performance rather than violence, allowing tension to be aired while keeping the group intact. Other societies use reconciliation practices, compensation, or temporary separation. The specifics vary, but the goal is recognizable. The group must remain functional. A long, unresolved conflict is not only emotionally unpleasant, it is a structural threat. It makes coordinated movement, shared childcare, pooled defense, and resource distribution harder. So there is pressure to conform, but also pressure to resolve. Both pressures serve the same underlying need. Cohesion is safety, and safety is not optional. What makes all of this more than sociology is that the pain of rejection seems to be written into our biology. Modern neuroscience suggests that social pain and physical pain share overlapping pathways in the brain, including regions involved in distress and threat detection. We do not know for certain how identical these systems were in deep prehistory, but the broad architecture is ancient and the evolutionary logic is straightforward. If being excluded from your group historically increased your risk of death, then an organism that experiences exclusion as deeply painful is more likely to take steps to avoid it. The pain is not moral, it is informative. It is a deterrent that arrives before reason can build a narrative around it. This is why embarrassment can feel like heat on the skin. This is why shame can feel like weight. These are not poetic metaphors. They are bodily experiences that can change behavior quickly, even when no one explains why. Under this lens, the emotional intensity of rejection is not evidence that something is wrong with us. It may be evidence that the system is working exactly as it was shaped to work, keeping us close to protection by making separation feel unbearable. This is the quiet center of the segment. Identity change hurts because it once risked separation from protection. Not because change is inherently tragic, and not because the self is sacred, but because the social world is a shelter that can close its door without saying a word. When we talk about identity in modern life, we often imagine it as an inner truth-seeking expression. But if we step back into the older logic, identity begins as an agreement, enforced by consequences. It is a way for others to know what to expect from you, and for you to know what you can expect from them. Deviating from that agreement might sometimes be necessary, even adaptive, but it is rarely socially neutral. The group may not punish you because it hates you. It may punish you because it cannot afford uncertainty. And because these sanctions can be gentle and persistent rather than dramatic, they can shape a person without leaving a visible scar. A few jokes, a few exclusions, a few cold silences. Enough to pull someone back into alignment, or to push them outward if the drift continues. We can see, even in the modern world, how quickly the body reacts to social cooling before language steps in to interpret it. A missed invitation can sting for reasons that feel irrational. A small public correction can linger for days. The feeling arrives first, and only later do we build the story. That sequence may be ancient, and it suggests something unsettling and oddly compassionate at the same time. Much of the suffering around identity change is not weakness. It is the echo of a survival economy where belonging was not a nice addition to life, it was the condition for life continuing. When we feel the fear of drift or the pain of being misunderstood, we're not merely being modern and sensitive. We may be encountering an older instrument, tuned across thousands of generations, reminding us that protection often came with terms and conditions. There is another layer to this, quieter than mockery and colder than outright exclusion. In small groups, information itself becomes a kind of boundary, and the simplest punishment is to be left outside the circle of knowing. You do not get told where the next water is, not because someone announces a sentence, but because conversation simply happens a few steps away from you. You do not hear the plan early enough to be useful. You arrive late to the shared decision, and your lateness is then treated as evidence that you cannot be relied upon. In a world where tomorrow's location is protection, being the last to know is not a social inconvenience, it is a slow removal from safety. We do not know for certain how deep into the Pleistocene this kind of informational gating reaches, but the structure is plausible wherever movement and coordination matter, and wherever knowledge is held by people rather than stored in objects. A band does not need a law to do this. It only needs attention and the ability to give it or withhold it. It is tempting to imagine sanctions as something imposed by a few dominant individuals, but in many small-scale contexts, enforcement can be distributed, almost automatic. One person laughs at your drift, another does not defend you. A third repeats the story later with a slight sharpening. None of them needs to plan it. The pressure emerges from the network itself, because reputations in such settings are not private possessions. They are shared tools. Anthropologists have long noted how gossip, story, and casual commentary function as a kind of social accounting in groups without formal institutions. Not always malicious, not always fair, but persistent. A group that depends on cooperation has to monitor who is safe to depend on, and one of the cheapest ways to do that is to circulate small observations about behaviour. A single odd action does not define a person, but a pattern does, and once a pattern becomes known, it gains weight that can outlast the moment that created it. This is part of why identity can feel sticky even when a person tries to change. It is not only internal habit, it is the inertia of other people's memory held in many minds at once. There is also the problem of ambiguity. When a person drifts from an expected role, the group often cannot immediately tell whether the drift is temporary, adaptive, or dangerous. In an environment where a single unreliable decision can lead to injury, starvation, or exposure, uncertainty itself becomes costly. That may be why so many human groups develop quick interpretive shortcuts. The urge to label someone as steady or not steady, safe or risky, based on limited evidence. We do not know for certain how early such categorizing tendencies emerged, but the cognitive machinery required for them is not exotic. It is built from ordinary social perception, attention to pattern, and the basic need to forecast other people. When your life depends on what someone else will do in the next hour, you do not have the luxury of endless nuance. This does not mean early humans were harsh by nature. It means the environment rewarded fast judgments, and fast judgments are rarely gentle. And then there is the body's own contribution to the punishment. Even before any conscious story forms, social threat can shift physiology. People who feel excluded often sleep worse, scan more, flinch more easily, and interpret neutral cues as warnings. We do not need to imagine this as modern fragility. It can be read as a calibrated response to a situation that historically preceded real danger. If the group is cooling toward you, you may need to watch more carefully, move more cautiously, conserve energy, and search for ways back into acceptance. In some cases, the safest strategy might have been to repair quickly, to apologize, to perform reliability, to become legible again. In other cases, the safer strategy might have been to leave before the door fully closed. Either way, the distress would have served a purpose. It would have pushed attention toward the social terrain, the terrain that could decide whether you ate and whether you were defended. So when we say identity change hurts, the hurt is not only philosophical, it is logistical. It is the nervous system anticipating the consequences of becoming unclear to the people whose protection once mattered more than self-definition. Even in a world filled with cities, contracts, and digital anonymity, the older circuitry still reacts as if the campfire were the whole world, and as if drifting meant sleeping alone at the edge of the dark. Imagine this. You walk into a camp where nobody needs to ask who you are, because your skin has already answered. Not with words, not with a story you chose to tell, but with a pattern that cannot be misread at a distance. The human body is easy to recognize, but the human allegiance is not. For most of our species' existence, survival depended on knowing who could be trusted, who belonged, and who carried obligations. In that kind of a world, identity is not only something felt, it is something made visible. And one of the oldest ways humans have tried to make visibility endure is to place it onto the body itself, where it travels with you when everything else can be dropped, forgotten, stolen, or left behind. We do not know for certain when the first deliberate bodily marks began, because flesh does not fossilize easily, and because many practices leave only the faintest trace. But the evidence suggests that, across many regions and many times, people repeatedly found ways to alter what does preserve: bone, tooth, skull, and sometimes hair or pigment trapped in rare conditions. In the archaeological record, cranial shaping appears in multiple areas of the world, identifiable in skulls whose form reflects sustained pressure applied in infancy when the cranium is still malleable. Dental modification appears too, sometimes as deliberate filing, chipping, notching, or the removal of specific teeth, changes that are difficult to explain as accident when the pattern is shared across individuals of similar age and social context. Scarification is harder to recover in deep time, but ethnographic comparison shows how it can function as a durable signature of belonging, and bioarchaeology reminds us that the absence of preserved skin does not mean the absence of practiced meaning. When we combine these lines carefully, without pretending we can read private thoughts from bone, a clear shape emerges. Many humans did not only perform who they were, they carried it literally in the visible architecture of the body. Why would a group do this, especially when many forms of marking are painful, risky, or time-consuming? One answer is that identity signals are only useful when they can be trusted. A mark that costs nothing can be copied by anyone who wants the benefit without the burden. A mark that hurts, that takes time to heal, that requires participation, supervision, and endurance, becomes harder to fake. This is not a moral story, and it is not a romantic one. It is a practical problem of social information. If group membership matters, then membership must be legible. If membership is valuable, then it will be imitated. And if it will be imitated, then the signal must acquire a cost that makes imitation difficult. We do not know which communities consciously reasoned this through, and we should not assume a formal theory in anyone's mind. But the underlying logic can arise without theory, simply through what works and what fails over generations. Practices that produce reliable recognition persist. Practices that do not are replaced. Seen this way, the body becomes a kind of social document, not a personal diary, but a public record. It tells others what they need to know quickly. Who is bound to whom? Who has passed through which threshold? Who has obligations? Who has earned trust? Who has accepted a role? In many ethnographic contexts, scar patterns can indicate age grades, initiatory status, marital availability, lineage, mourning, or access to certain forms of knowledge. Dental alteration can signal adulthood, resilience, or affiliation. Cranial shaping can mark community membership so early that the individual grows into the identity rather than choosing it. And this is the point that tends to unsettle modern listeners. Some identities were designed to arrive before consent could even be imagined. If a mark is applied in infancy, it does not announce who you decided to become. It announces who your community decided you were allowed to be. Archaeology forces a certain humility here, because the same physical alteration can have different meanings in different places. Cranial modification, for example, has appeared in contexts that include status differentiation, ethnic identity, or aesthetic preference, and sometimes several at once. Dental modification can be tied to rites of passage, but it can also relate to ideas of beauty, ferocity, self-control, or spiritual protection. We do not know for certain which meaning dominates in any single prehistoric case, unless the cultural context can be triangulated with settlement patterning, burial treatment, associated objects, and repeated patterning across individuals. Even then, certainty is rare. But the repeated recurrence of the practice itself is meaningful. A community does not consistently reshape heads or alter teeth by accident. These are deliberate intergenerational choices made in the open. Whatever their local meanings, they share a structural effect. They make identity durable, hard to deny, and difficult to revise. That irreversibility matters. In earlier segments, we looked at how roles can be enacted, recognized and enforced through expectations, through space, and through social pressure. Marking adds a more permanent layer. It limits the possibility of quiet escape. If identity is only behavior, it can sometimes be adjusted gradually, tested, hidden, or softened. If identity is written into the body, it cannot be taken off at night. It follows you into another valley. It arrives before you speak. It announces your history to strangers. It also binds you more tightly to your own people, because to abandon them would mean carrying the mark of belonging into a world where it might invite suspicion or violence. In that sense, bodily marking does not only communicate identity, it manufactures commitment. It makes affiliation costly to reverse, and therefore harder to betray in moments of fear, hunger, or ambition. There is also a quieter human side that the data cannot fully capture, but does not need imagination to be plausible. A mark is a memory you cannot misplace. It sits in the same place every day. For some people it may have been pride, for others obligation, for others simply the normal state of being. A child grows into the shape their community pressed upon them, and eventually it may not feel like an inscription at all. It may feel like the body's natural truth. That is one of the strange powers of social life. Repeated expectation can become internal experience. A role becomes a posture. A posture becomes a sense of self, and a sense of self begins to feel ancient, even when it was assigned. When we talk about identity existing before choice, this is one of the starkest meanings of that phrase. Some communities did not wait for a person to declare who they were. They declared it onto them. So the revelation here is not that ancient people were cruel, or that they lacked individuality, or that every human everywhere was marked. The record is too diverse for that. The revelation is that humans repeatedly invented ways to make belonging visible and credible, and sometimes they chose the body as the most reliable surface. Because bodies travel, because bodies are witnessed, because bodies cannot easily lie, and because in a world where roles mattered, durability mattered too. Some identities were not merely performed, they were carved into permanence. And where the body could not be marked, objects carried the message. Imagine this. You live in a world with no mirrors, no photographs, no polished metal, no glass, no place to check your own face the way we do without thinking. The only way you ever really see yourself is in water, and even that is unreliable. Wind breaks it, dusk darkens it, ripples distort it, and most days you're busy enough not to stop and stare. And yet, in that same world, someone takes a small shell with a natural hole, threads it onto a fibre cord, rubs it with pigment, and wears it close to the body. Someone else gathers ochre, not only for practical tasks, but in quantities and forms that suggest it mattered in ways we cannot fully measure. The act looks almost familiar. It looks like decoration. But when we step back into the deep time logic of survival, the question changes. If you are not trying to admire yourself, who are you decorating for? We do not know for certain what any one bead meant to any one person. Archaeology does not give us diaries. It gives us residues, patterns, and the strange honesty of things that were never meant to last. But the evidence suggests that personal ornaments emerge early enough to force a hard conclusion. Long before writing, long before states, long before formal rank titles, humans were already using small portable objects to communicate something about who they were in relation to others. Not essence, not inner truth, not the private self. Something more external and often more urgent. Group membership, familiarity, shared language without words, a way of saying, quietly, before anyone speaks, I am not a stranger in the dangerous sense of the word. Some of the most discussed traces come from the Middle Stone Age in southern Africa, where the preservation is good enough to let small things survive. At Blombos Cave on the southern Cape coast, shells of Nassarius craussianus were recovered that show wear consistent with stringing, along with traces of ochre staining. The dates for these finds are often placed around 75,000 years ago, depending on the layers and methods used. The shells are not food refuse in the usual sense. They are small, selected, modified by use, and they recur in numbers that suggest practice rather than accident. In the same broader region and time range, other caves preserve ochre pieces with grinding facets, suggesting repeated processing, sometimes alongside engraved ochre fragments that show deliberate patterning. None of this proves symbolism in the way people like to imagine it, but it does strongly support something simpler and more grounded. These groups invested time in making visible signals that travelled with the body. The logic of a portable signal matters because mobility is the default condition for most of our species' history. If your world is made of seasonal movement, shifting resources and changing neighbours, then identity cannot depend on buildings or borders. It has to be carried. A shell bead is small enough to keep through travel, light enough not to cost much energy, and visible enough to work as a cue. It also has a useful feature that is not about beauty at all. It can be standardized. When many people choose similar shells, drill or select similar perforations, string them in similar ways, and stain them with similar pigments, you get a shared style. A shared style is not just taste, it is a kind of social infrastructure. It tells you that the person in front of you knows the same conventions you do. It tells you they have participated in the same small acts of making, that they have access to the same materials or exchange partners, and that they are likely embedded in a network that reaches beyond the immediate camp. This is where archaeology begins to speak in a quiet, statistical voice. One bead is hard to interpret. A repeated pattern across many beads, across layers, across sites, begins to behave like evidence. At several Middle Stone Age and early Upper Paleolithic contexts, researchers have looked not only at the presence of ornaments, but at their manufacture and wear, asking whether they were worn, how long, and whether the pattern of use is consistent with clothing or direct skin contact. When beads show polishing where they rubbed against other beads or against cord, when they show pigment residues that suggest deliberate colouring, the simplest explanation is also the strongest. These objects were meant to be seen by others, not by a hypothetical audience in the future, and not by the wearer in a mirror, but by the people who mattered in daily life. The ones who decide whether you're safe, whether you're trusted, whether you're fed when the hunt fails, whether you're allowed to move with them when the landscape changes again. A second cluster of evidence comes from the Eastern Mediterranean, where shells appear at sites associated with early Homo sapiens. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 Cave, for example, marine shells interpreted as personal ornaments have been discussed in contexts dated to around 100,000 years ago. These shells appear inland, which already implies transport, exchange, or purposeful collection during travel. Some show traces consistent with suspension and pigment. The point is not to claim that the meaning at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 was identical to the meaning at Blombos. It almost certainly was not. Meaning is local. But the behaviour has a shared structure, selecting objects that can be worn, moving them away from their original environment, and treating them in ways that make them suitable for display. When that structure appears in different regions and times, it suggests that humans repeatedly discovered the same solution to the same pressure. If your survival depends on social predictability, then a visible cue of belonging is not a luxury. It is a strategy. There is a temptation, especially in modern minds, to turn ornaments into the story of self-expression, to imagine a person thinking, I want to look beautiful. Beauty is real, and preferences are real, and aesthetics are not an invention of modernity. But the archaeological question is sharper than that. In small foraging groups, the line between beauty and signalling is thin because both are social. What looks pleasing may do so because it is familiar. What looks familiar may do so because it is shared. And what is shared can be used to map allies, kin, and safe relations in a world where a wrong encounter can become fatal. When researchers talk about ornaments as signalling, they're not reducing humans to machines. They're acknowledging that the human social world is a survival environment as real as any climate or predator field. Even the act of standardization points in this direction. Standardization is not simply repetition, it is coordination. It implies that there is some expectation about how something should look, how it should be made, and who is allowed to wear it. We cannot assume strict rules, and we should not imagine rigid uniforms. But we can say that shared styles likely required shared learning, and shared learning implies social transmission that mattered enough to preserve. A bead style that repeats across communities hints at contact, or at least at a common ancestry of practice. It can mark networks, sometimes stretching across landscapes. In this way, an ornament is not just an object, it is a small node in a social map. Ochre plays a similar role, though it is more slippery because it also has practical uses. Pigments can preserve hides, protect skin, aid in adhesives, and serve as a raw material in compound technologies. We do not have to decide between practical and social in order to see the deeper point. In many cases, practical and social reinforce each other. If a pigment is already present for functional reasons, it becomes available for marking bodies, objects, or spaces. If it becomes part of group practice, it becomes a recognizable cue. At sites like Pinnacle Point on the South African coast, ochre use has been documented deep into the Middle Stone Age, with evidence of processing that implies repeated collection and preparation. In some contexts, the quantities and handling suggest that ochre mattered enough to be carried and curated. Again, we do not know the exact meanings, but the persistence suggests it was more than incidental dirt. It is also worth noticing what ornaments do not require. They do not require permanent settlements. They do not require leaders with titles. They do not require writing. They do not require formal ceremonies in the way later societies sometimes do. They can exist in a small band moving along a coastline or through river valleys, meeting other groups briefly, trading partners, exchanging mates, or avoiding conflict through recognizability. In such a world, a portable identity claim can function almost like a handshake before the handshake exists. It is a way to reduce uncertainty. And uncertainty in human social life is rarely neutral. It is the raw material of fear. So why decorate in a world without spectators the way we imagine them? Because the spectators were never imaginary. They were the only ones who mattered. The audience was the group, the neighbouring group, the people you might need tomorrow when the weather shifts, when illness strikes, when a child is lost, when a hunt fails. An ornament is a small pre-sentence. It speaks without language. It suggests, I know your world. I have been shaped by a world compatible with yours. I carry the signs that you recognize, and you can carry yours back to me. This is not romantic. It is practical in the deepest sense. And yet, there is still something quietly human in it that does not reduce to risk management. When a bead is worn long enough to polish, when pigment is reapplied, when a cord is repaired, there is maintenance. Maintenance is attention. Attention is value. Even if the original reason was social signalling, the act of keeping a marker close to the body can become emotionally saturated over time. Humans attach feeling to what protects them. We do not know exactly how early this began, but it would be strange if it did not begin at all. A bead necklace can be a tool and a comfort simultaneously. A pigment can be both practical and intimate. The archaeological record cannot confirm tenderness, but it can confirm continuity, and continuity is often where tenderness hides. The deeper realization, then, is not that humans invented decoration. It is that humans invented portable belonging. Before identity becomes a word, before it becomes a story people tell themselves, it exists as a set of visible cues that make social life workable. Adornment in this light is not primarily about self-esteem. It is about legibility. It is about being read correctly in a world where being misread could be costly. Long before self-improvement, long before careers, long before public reputation in the modern sense, there was the simpler question: are you one of us? And can we know that quickly enough to matter? And once you understand ornaments that way, a final detail becomes hard to ignore. Belonging is never only an inward feeling, it is always a boundary as well. If a bead style marks a network, it also implies those outside the network. If pigment marks a group, it also marks the unmarked. Even without hostility, a signal creates categories, because signals exist to differentiate. The quiet declaration, "I belong," works only because there is a world in which not everyone belongs to the same circle. The first ornaments may have been gentle, but they were not neutral. They carried information. They changed how strangers became familiar, and how familiar became safe. And belonging always implies an outside. A fire in the open, low and controlled, the kind that keeps its light close to the ground. Beyond it, the world is mostly darkness, wind, and listening. Somewhere out there, another group is moving. You cannot hear their words. You may not even share any. But the moment they step into the edge of the glow, you still feel the difference. Not in some dramatic way. In the quiet way a body knows when something is not familiar. The question is not whether early humans had identity. The question is how they recognized a boundary before they could explain what a boundary was. How do you detect "not us" without language to name it, without mirrors to rehearse it, without the comfort of a written category to hide behind? We do not know for certain what an individual thought when they first saw an unfamiliar camp across a valley, or a line of strangers approaching a water source. The archaeological record does not preserve fear as a sentence, but the evidence suggests that long before formal symbols, long before flags, long before anyone could say "my people" in a stable, abstract way, humans were already living inside patterns. And patterns can be read. Some of the clearest traces come from what archaeologists call style. Not style in the modern sense of fashion, but style as the consistent, repeatable choices that shape tools, ornaments, and material habits. These choices are often unnecessary for function. A stone point will still cut if it is shaped slightly differently. A scraper will still scrape if its edge is maintained another way. Yet across time and landscape, groups tend to repeat certain ways of doing things, even when many alternatives would work. That repetition becomes a fingerprint, and in small mobile societies fingerprints matter because they tell you something you can use before you can trust. In many regions, stone tools carry signatures that are partly ecological and partly social. Raw material choices can reflect local geology, yes, but not only geology. When we see a consistent preference for certain sources of stone, even when other workable stone is available, it suggests habits of movement, known roots, and inherited knowledge about where our stone comes from. In parts of Africa during the Middle Stone Age, we find evidence of long-distance transport of high-quality materials such as obsidian, sometimes moving tens of kilometers from their sources. That movement is not simply practical. It implies familiarity with territory and with the social landscape inside that territory. If obsidian appears at a site far from the nearest flow, it tells us someone carried it or exchanged it. Either way, there is a line drawn across space, and lines, even invisible ones, are where us and not us begin to appear. What exchange really demonstrates is not only connection, but boundary. You do not exchange with everyone. You exchange with those you can approach without expecting immediate harm. Those you have met before, those who have reasons to keep meeting you. The existence of exchange networks, even intermittent ones, suggests a world in which strangers were not always treated as enemies, but also not treated as kin. Exchange becomes a proof of negotiated contact managed through repeated interaction, and repeated interaction requires recognition. In other words, you need to know who you are dealing with, not as an essence, but as a risk calculation. A group with whom you have a known pattern of exchange is less unknown than the group you have never met. That difference is not philosophy, it is survival. Style becomes useful here because it can travel faster than trust. If you see a certain type of point shape, a certain pattern of retouch along an edge, a familiar way of hafting that leaves a particular fracture signature, you might infer a lineage of teaching. You might infer a set of hands trained by the same hands that trained your own. This is not certainty, it is probability. But probability is what risk management is made of. In a world where injuries heal slowly, where infection is a real threat, where food stress can turn calm into desperation, you do not need perfect information. You need enough information to decide whether to step closer or step back. Even the distribution of tool traditions across landscapes can suggest cultural frontiers. Archaeologists see clusters of shared technological approaches that persist through time, then fade or blend at edges. Those edges are rarely neat. They are zones, not lines. But zones still matter. They imply that people in one region were learning and repeating one set of methods, while people nearby were repeating another. Sometimes these differences correlate with ecology. Sometimes they do not. When they do not, it becomes difficult to avoid a social explanation. Not because archaeologists want a story, but because repeated difference without functional necessity is often what culture looks like when all you have is stone. The same is true for ornaments, though the record is uneven. Where shell beads, 𝐓𝐾𝐒, or other personal adornments appear, their forms and patterns can be regionally distinctive. A bead is not only a bead. Its species of shell, its size, its drilling technique, the way it is strung, the way it is coloured, the way it is worn, these can become shared conventions. Shared conventions are readable. They can tell an observer, at a distance, that you belong somewhere, not as a passport, but as a signal. Signals do not need language to function. They only need consistent interpretation across repeated encounters. None of this implies constant hostility. It implies caution. It implies assessment. Intergroup contact could bring opportunity, new mates, new knowledge, new access routes, or safe passage. It could also bring danger, theft, violence, disease, or simply competition at the wrong moment. In small-scale societies, the cost of misjudgment can be immediate. So the mind, even without formal categories, becomes attentive to cues. Identity, in this sense, is not first a personal statement. It is a filter. It helps you decide how open to be, how close to stand, what to offer, what to hide, whether to share the fire or keep it small. We can see echoes of this logic in ethnographic records of recent and historic foraging societies, though we must be careful. Ethnography is not a time machine, but it can show how subtle cues, dialect differences, body adornment and tool preferences function as boundary markers in societies without centralized institutions. Often, such markers are not used for everyday internal life. They become most visible at edges when outsiders appear. That matters because it suggests that identity is sharpened by contact. It becomes clearer when it is tested. The stranger at the edge of the firelight forces a question that family does not. Are you safe for us, and are we safe for you? This is where the emotional dimension enters quietly, without any need for speeches. The human stress system is sensitive to uncertainty, and uncertainty is what outsiders represent. But the response is not only fear, it can be curiosity, calculation, restraint, and sometimes deliberate friendliness. The point is that identity, when it operates as a risk management system, does not have to be moral. It only has to be effective. It makes the world simpler to navigate. It reduces the overwhelming complexity of possible outcomes into a few practical categories: familiar, allied, unknown, threatening. Those categories are not written, they are lived. And because they are lived, they begin to leave traces beyond material style. They shape movement. They shape where people choose to camp. They shape how close groups approach one another. They shape the existence of buffer zones, contested water sources, repeated meeting places, and routes that avoid certain valleys. Many of these behaviours do not fossilize cleanly, but the patchwork of evidence, the distribution of artifacts, the presence of non-local materials, and the persistence of regional patterns all suggest that humans were already living inside social maps, not only ecological maps. If this is true, then one of the earliest functions of identity was not to express uniqueness, but to manage exposure. To be us meant to be legible, predictable, and therefore less costly to deal with. To be not us meant uncertainty, and uncertainty demanded caution. Identity begins to look less like a personal treasure and more like a tool, a way of reducing risk in a world full of strangers. And once identity functions like that, something else becomes almost inevitable. When risk enters, humans start to explain it. Not in formal theory, not in written doctrine, but in narrative. The mind does not like raw uncertainty. It prefers shaped uncertainty, the kind that can be remembered and transmitted. The first time a stranger helps you, the first time a stranger harms you, the first time a meeting changes the fate of a child or the survival of a camp, those events do not remain only as facts. They become examples, they become warnings, they become the beginnings of story. And stories in time will become one of the most powerful ways identity is taught. And once risk enters, stories begin to form. Imagine this. You wake up in a world where nothing about you is written down, not on paper, not in a record, not even in a name that stays fixed. Yesterday you were the one who carried the hides. Today you might be the one who walks behind the children, scanning the grass for movement. Tomorrow you might be injured, slower, dependent, and suddenly the group has to decide what you are now. If identity began as role, then the question is almost unavoidable. When did a human start to feel like the same person across changing days? When did the self stop being only a set of visible behaviours and become a thread, held in the mind, that could survive shifts in usefulness, status, and place? The strange part is that the archaeological record can show us the roles in motion, the camps, the tools, the traces of food and fire. What it cannot easily show is the inner glue. And yet the evidence from cognitive science and ethnography suggests that humans may have invented a stabilizing technology that is softer than stone and more portable than any artifact: story. We do not know for certain when narrative selfhood, in the sense of a continuous autobiographical me, became possible. but the evidence suggests it required a particular kind of memory, one that can do more than store facts. Humans are not the only creatures who remember, but human memory is unusually good at stitching events into sequences that feel owned. Cognitive researchers often distinguish between knowing and reliving, between semantic knowledge and episodic recollection. The second is the strange one. It is the ability to mentally travel backward into a specific moment, to re-enter a scene with a viewpoint, a body, a feeling. The moment you can do that, you can also do something else. You can compare who you were in that remembered moment to who you are now. And comparison is where coherence begins to form, even if it is imperfect. In unstable lives, coherence is not a luxury. It is a way of preventing the self from dissolving into disconnected tasks. An early forager who moves across territories loses access to familiar places, shifts diet, shifts companions, shifts risk, is living a life that does not naturally produce neat continuity. If the mind had no method for keeping track of itself, then every change in role could feel like a small disappearance. Narrative is one solution, not because it is always accurate, but because it is organized. Ethnography gives a glimpse of how this might work in societies where daily survival is close to the surface. In many small-scale communities, story is not merely entertainment. It is an instrument for placing people inside a social memory. People are spoken about, not only in terms of what they do, but in terms of what they have done, what they are known for, what kind of person they have repeatedly been. That social storytelling acts like an externalized autobiographical record. It stabilizes reputation. It creates continuity that does not depend on one person's private recollection, which can be biased, fragmented, or self-protective. In this sense, narrative becomes a form of social infrastructure. It says, "This is the one who shared meat when the rains failed. This is the one who panicked on the ridge. This is the one who found the water." The details may shift in retelling, but the function remains. The group turns a sequence of actions into a predictable identity, and predictability reduces risk. If you can anticipate how someone tends to behave, you can coordinate with them when conditions worsen. You can decide how close to stand to them when uncertainty rises. You can decide whether they are safe to follow. And then there is language, which changes the entire architecture of identity. Before language, roles can be recognized, but they cannot be labeled in a stable, portable way. With language, a role can outlive the moment it is enacted. You can refer to a person when they are not present. You can compare their behavior to what they were expected to be. You can preserve a version of them in the minds of others, even when they are asleep, even when they are far away, even when they are dead. The emergence of names and kinship terms is especially important here, because these are among the most durable identity anchors humans have ever used. A name is not just a tag. It is a handle that lets other people pull you into conversation, memory, and evaluation. Kinship terms do something even deeper. They place you inside a map that existed before you were born. Even if your role shifts, you are still someone's child, someone's sibling, someone's parent, someone's cousin, someone's in-law. That relational net is a kind of continuity machine. It does not depend on performance alone. It makes you legible through connection. And in many societies, kinship is not sentimental decoration. It is the operating system of obligation, assistance, and trust. When roles change, kinship can keep a person from falling out of the social world entirely. This is where identity begins to resemble narrative more than a fixed essence. The mind does not merely record life, it edits it. It compresses, highlights, smooths, and sometimes rewrites. Autobiographical memory, as researchers describe it, is not a passive archive. It is a coherence-making system. It selects events that support a sense of continuity and pushes other events into the background. That means the self you feel inside your own head may be less a discovery and more a construction, built to function. In a volatile environment, whether that volatility is ecological, social, or interpersonal, coherence reduces anxiety because it reduces the number of possible selves you might become. If you can say, even silently, I am the kind of person who returns, or I am the kind of person who does not abandon, or I am the kind of person who stays calm, you have created a rule that predicts your future behaviour. The rule might be partly myth, but it is a myth that makes you easier to navigate, both for yourself and for others. It becomes an internal treaty. The mind agrees to remain consistent enough to be steerable. This may also explain why identity change hurts in a way that does not feel purely rational. If your self is partly a narrative built to maintain predictability, then changing that narrative threatens the system that kept fear manageable. A shifting story is not simply new information, it is a risk to coherence. And coherence is not only personal, it is social. The stories that hold a person together are usually not told in isolation. They are shared, reinforced, corrected, and sometimes punished. If you try to revise your story too quickly, you're not only changing your private self-image, you're becoming harder to predict for the people who rely on you. In small groups, unpredictability is rarely interpreted neutrally. It raises questions. Are you unstable? Are you unsafe? Are you hiding something? Are you leaving? The group does not need formal institutions to react to this. It only needs memory, gossip, and the quiet power of attention. Ethnography shows again and again that people are shaped by what is said about them, and by what they sense is being said. In that light, narrative identity is not simply a psychological comfort, it is a negotiated social contract, and still, there is something quietly human here that is worth noticing without romanticizing it. A coherent me may not be the deepest truth of a person, but it is an astonishing adaptation. It allows a creature to live through change without shattering into fragments. It allows someone to endure loss of role, loss of status, loss of strength, loss of place, and still feel like a continuous being who can be addressed, remembered, and relied upon. The archaeological record shows us movement, replacement, innovation, abandonment, adaptation. But beneath those visible shifts, there had to be a way for individuals to keep going psychologically, not just physically. Narrative may have been that method, a shelter made of sequence and meaning. Not a perfect shelter, not an honest shelter, but a functional one. The self becomes a story because stories can be carried when nothing else can, and because a story can offer predictability in a life that does not naturally provide it. It is a private agreement with instability, written in memory, revised in conversation, and reinforced by the faces around the fire. The problem, of course, is that once story becomes the glue, it can also become a cage. If your coherence depends on being the same, then the price of change is not only practical, it is existential. To revise the story is to risk becoming unreadable, both to yourself and to the group that has learned to expect you in a particular shape. That may be why identity feels so heavy even when it is invisible, and why the smallest deviations can trigger disproportionate fear, shame, or resistance. The mind is not only trying to protect comfort, it may be trying to protect coherence itself, because coherence kept survival manageable. And yet stories cannot fully escape the group. Imagine for a moment. Not a person alone with an inner monologue. Not a private self waiting to be expressed. but a human standing in the thin, practical light of other people's attention. In a small group, where food is shared or withheld, where someone watches who contributes, who hesitates, who takes too much, who returns when they say they will, identity is not a secret you carry. It is a pattern you negotiate. It is what others can safely assume about you when the landscape turns harsh, when a child cries, when the fire needs tending, when the group decides whether to move. In that kind of world, the question is not, who am I, really? The question is quieter and sharper. Who do they need me to be, and what do I need to be allowed to remain among them? It is tempting to imagine that identity begins as self-discovery, and only later becomes social. The evidence suggests the opposite. Long before anyone could claim a personality in words, humans were already living inside a social agreement, one made of expectations, obligations, and the daily risk of misreading one another. In the 20th century of the Common Era, social psychologists began describing something that, in hindsight, feels less like a modern insight and more like a late label for an old mechanism. Social identity theory, most closely associated with Henri Tajfel and John Turner, argued that people do not only understand themselves as individuals, they also understand themselves through the groups they belong to, and they protect those group identities because membership brings value, safety, and meaning. In laboratory studies that became famous for their simplicity, people assigned to arbitrary groups with no history, no shared suffering, no real stakes, could still show favoritism toward us and suspicion toward them. The unsettling part is not that humans can be tribal. The unsettling part is how little it takes to wake the machinery. We do not know how directly such experiments map onto deep time, and it would be careless to pretend a modern university setting is a Pleistocene camp. But the core logic, that group membership shapes perception and behaviour, aligns closely with what survival would have demanded in small exposed communities. If your life depends on a handful of allies, then categories are not ideology. They are navigation. They help you decide who shares, who defends, who warns, who stays calm when something goes wrong. They help you predict, and prediction, in a world with real consequences, is a form of shelter. To see identity as a social contract is to notice the loops that keep it alive. A role is offered or assumed. The group responds. The response reinforces the role. Over time, the role becomes what everyone expects, including the person performing it. This is not mystical. It is structural. Mutual recognition is the glue. It is the repeated confirmation that you are legible, that you make sense to others, that you will probably do tomorrow what you did yesterday, at least in the ways that matter. When scholars talk about status and belonging, it can sound like abstract sociology, but in a small foraging band it is often material. Status can mean who is listened to when decisions are made, who is trusted to handle a risky task, who is believed when they report what they saw beyond the ridge. Belonging can mean who receives help when injured, who is protected when vulnerable, who is included when food is divided. Behavioural expectations are not decorations on top of life. They are part of the infrastructure that keeps life from collapsing into suspicion. The more uncertain the environment, the more valuable it becomes to know that the people beside you are predictable in the ways that keep the group functioning. This is where identity consistency starts to look less like a personal preference and more like a public utility. In modern language, someone might say, "I want to be authentic," as if identity is primarily an internal truth waiting to be honoured. In deep time, the more urgent problem was reliability. A group that cannot anticipate its members cannot coordinate, and coordination is often the difference between surviving a difficult season and failing quietly in the margins of the landscape. Think of what coordination requires, not in dramatic scenes, but in the dull, repeated moments that make survival possible. Someone needs to return when they say they will. Someone needs to carry a burden without renegotiating the terms halfway. Someone needs to share information without exaggerating it. Someone needs to keep a promise when no one is watching, because later everyone will live in the consequences. In those conditions, inconsistency is not merely confusing, it is dangerous. It forces the group to spend energy monitoring, doubting, rechecking, and second-guessing. Over time, groups gravitate toward people who reduce uncertainty and away from people who multiply it. This does not require formal institutions or written rules. It only requires memory, pattern recognition, and the quiet arithmetic of risk. Archaeology cannot show us the exact conversation where a person was judged unreliable, where a group decided silently to stop trusting. But archaeology does show that human life was rarely solitary, and it shows the scale of cooperation implied by many survival strategies. It shows the long dependence of the young, the persistence of care for people who could not have survived alone, and the repeated use of locations that suggest shared knowledge across time. When a community invests in its vulnerable, it is not only being kind, it is also reinforcing the logic that membership matters, that the group is more than a temporary gathering of individuals. That investment creates a pressure for legibility. If the group carries you when you are weak, it needs to know who you are when you are strong. And if you want the group to carry you, you learn, early, what must remain stable about you so that others keep choosing you. The contract is not signed, it is enacted. It is renewed through routines, through cooperation, through the way a person becomes predictable enough to be included without debate. Once you view identity this way, the famous sentence about consistency shifts its meaning. The strongest force in the human personality may not be a craving for self-consistency for its own sake. It may be the pressure to remain consistent so that others can keep trusting you. The self, in this light, is not only something you experience, it is something other people need to read. And reading you correctly is not merely emotional, it is practical. This is why identity is so often conservative, even in a species capable of change. The group does not only ask, can you become different? The group also asks, if you become different, what else changes? And what risks does that introduce for all of us? In small-scale societies documented by ethnographers, norms can be enforced through subtle means, through gossip, avoidance, ridicule, or quiet withdrawal of support. You do not need a prison to produce conformity. You only need a community where support is finite, and reputation travels faster than apologies. In such a setting, the desire to remain stable is not necessarily a love of routine. It is a strategy to keep the social world from turning cold. And yet, the contract is not purely oppressive. It is also how humans make collective life possible at all. In-group identity can function as a psychological shelter because it offers a framework for what to expect, what is permitted, what is admired, what is forbidden. It reduces the mental load of constant negotiation. It allows people to coordinate without reinventing the rules each morning. This is why group membership can feel comforting even when it constrains, and why it can feel frightening even to imagine losing it. The cost of leaving a role is not only internal discomfort, it is uncertainty about how others will respond, whether the protective network will still hold, whether your contributions will still be recognized, whether your changed behavior will be interpreted as growth or as betrayal. We do not know how early humans would have described such feelings, and it is possible they would not have separated emotion from social consequence the way modern people sometimes try to. But the underlying logic is ancient. A coherent individual matters, yes, but a functional group matters first. In a dangerous world, groups that hold together outlast groups that dissolve. If identity exists partly to keep groups functional, then it makes sense that the individual self is shaped around that need, like a tool shaped around a hand. So when a person tries to change and feels a surprising resistance that does not match their rational intentions, it may not be because they are weak or unmotivated. It may be because they are pushing against an old structure built for mutual dependence. They are disturbing a contract that others rely on, and that they themselves have relied on, often without noticing. The discomfort can feel personal, like an internal argument, but it is also social, like invisible hands holding the old shape in place. Even in a modern world where you can, in theory, switch communities, switch roles, switch careers, the machinery still runs on the same ancient fuel: recognition, trust, predictability, and the fear of being left outside the circle when the night turns cold. Identity may have existed to keep groups functional first, and individuals coherent second. And that is why changing yourself can feel like betrayal. You are a person whose life has been held together by agreements you never signed. Not laws, not written vows, just the quiet, repeated expectations that tell everyone where you belong, what you do, who trusts you, and who does not. And then one season, the agreements stop working. The water is in the wrong place. The animals do not return when they should. A familiar group arrives from the other side of a ridge wearing different ornaments, carrying unfamiliar stone, speaking in rhythms your ear does not settle into. Nothing supernatural happens, no single dramatic break. And yet, a role that once fit you becomes unusable, the way a tool becomes useless when the edge breaks and the stone is too small to rework. If identity was role and contract, what remains when roles collapse? Not the inner self, because prehistory does not preserve private diaries. What remains is the wake of change, a pattern of absences, a rearranged camp, a style that stops appearing, a habit that no longer makes sense. This is one of archaeology's most uncomfortable lessons, because it asks us to accept evidence that arrives sideways. The record rarely hands us a clear announcement that says the old identities ended here. What it gives instead are cultural discontinuities, the moments when familiar ways of making, wearing, and living shift fast enough that continuity becomes hard to defend. Sometimes it looks like an entire toolkit reorganizing, not because a clever inventor woke up inspired, but because the social structure that taught and rewarded certain skills has changed. Sometimes it looks like a long silence at a place that used to draw repeated visits, followed by a return that is not quite a return, because the hearths are placed differently, the debris scatters in new zones, the raw materials come from other directions. We do not know for certain what any single discontinuity meant emotionally, but the evidence suggests that these breaks often map onto social reorganization, not merely technological fashion. When the patterns of life change, the patterns of identity change with them, because roles are made inside patterns, and when the pattern breaks, the role becomes a question again. One of the clearest indirect ways to see this is style. Not style as decoration for its own sake, but style as a social signal that travels with people. In many regions and time periods, early personal ornaments appear and disappear in ways that suggest affiliation, not only aesthetic preference. Shell beads, pierced teeth, ivory pendants, ochre staining, standardized shapes and repeated arrangements. These do not behave like private hobbies. They behave like group grammar, shared enough to be recognized, but variable enough to mark difference. And the striking thing is how quickly such grammars can shift. A bead type that spreads through a network can also vanish from it, replaced by another that carries a different message. The shift might track new alliances, new marriage exchanges, new boundaries, or new ways of defining who counts as inside. A person can change a tool because a better edge is useful. A group changes a style when the meaning of belonging has moved. Archaeology cannot tell us what it felt like to watch your old markers become irrelevant, but it can show us that the markers were not stable. Identity signals were portable, but they were also fragile because they depended on mutual recognition. If the audience changes, the signal changes too. Then there is settlement, which sounds like a blunt category until you look closely. A camp is not merely a place to sleep. It is a social diagram made of distances, where hearths sit in relation to sleeping areas, where napping debris accumulates, where food processing happens, where children linger, where strangers are kept at the edge. When those patterns shift, it is rarely only because people got bored of the old layout. Settlement patterns change when the coordination of daily life changes, and coordination is one of the hidden engines of identity. A move toward longer stays in certain areas can produce new roles simply because continuity creates new responsibilities. Someone must watch stored food. Someone must manage disputes when people cannot simply drift apart. Someone must take on tasks that only exist when the group remains within one social field for longer. And yet, even when the archaeological record shows more persistent occupation in later periods, it often shows it arriving tentatively. Not as a confident step into permanence, but as an experiment, interrupted, revised, tried again elsewhere. This matters because it suggests that identity was repeatedly renegotiated as living arrangements changed. If roles are contracts, then the settlement is the meeting room. Rearrange the room, and the contract terms begin to shift. Innovation, in this light, becomes less romantic and more human. We tend to imagine invention as a bright moment in a single mind, but in deep time, the evidence often suggests that what looks like technological novelty is also social renegotiation. A new tool type can spread because it solves a problem, yes, but it can also spread because it changes who is valuable. It changes what competence looks like. It changes who teaches and who follows. It changes what kind of cooperation is possible, and therefore what kind of person can be trusted. When a hunting strategy shifts, it does not only change calories, it changes reputations. When new ornament styles appear, they can signal new affiliations, but they also create new ways to be judged. When a group begins to rely more on certain resources, the people skilled at accessing or processing them can rise in importance, and the social contract adjusts around that. We do not know for certain how consciously anyone perceived this, but the archaeological record repeatedly hints at a truth that modern life sometimes hides behind paperwork. Social change is not only an effect of technology. Social change is one of the forces that selects which technologies survive. And then there are the absences that feel almost cruel in their simplicity. A pattern ends. A place goes quiet. A set of materials disappears from a region's assemblages. A style boundary hardens where it used to blur, or blurs where it used to harden. Sometimes these are consequences of climate and ecology, and sometimes they are consequences of contact, movement, and shifting alliances. Whatever the driver, the record forces us to accept that identity was never a finished thing. There is no final identity waiting at the end of prehistory, no stable form of being human that arrives and then holds. What we see instead is changing contracts under pressure, contracts rewritten not by committee but by necessity. The agreement might be as small as who shares food with whom this season, or as large as which groups recognize each other as kin enough to exchange mates and materials. But the logic is consistent. Identity is legibility. Identity is membership. Identity is the set of expectations that lets others predict whether you are safe to rely on Change the network and you change the terms of legibility. If your old identity was a role inside an old agreement, then when the agreement dissolves, you do not simply lose a habit. You lose a place in a system that once made you make sense. This is why identity was never a private possession. Even when modern people speak about identity as something deeply internal, it still functions as a negotiation with an audience. In prehistory, that audience was not abstract. It was the people who shared your risk, the people who remembered your behaviour, the people whose cooperation meant warmth, food, protection, and sometimes survival itself. And time was also part of the audience, in a strange way, because time changes the environment that makes certain roles possible. A role can collapse because the group changes its needs, and the group can change its needs because the land changes its terms. In that sense, identity is a fragile agreement with other people and with time. It can be stable for a while, and then it can fail without asking your permission. We do not know for certain how often individuals resisted these shifts, but we can say that the record is full of reorganization, and reorganization implies friction. Someone had to adapt. Someone had to learn new ways to be useful. Someone had to accept that yesterday's competence was not a guaranteed passport into tomorrow's belonging. That is not motivational. It is simply what the evidence, in its quiet way, keeps telling us. The first roles we were given were not chosen, but they taught us what it cost to become someone else. Long before humans invented personal freedom, they learned that belonging has a shape, and changing that shape has always carried a price.